August 10th, 2018, a state courtroom in San Francisco. A jury delivers a verdict that will rewrite the rules of global finance. Dewayne Johnson, a former school groundskeeper suffering from terminal non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, wins $289 million in damages against the agricultural giant Monsanto. The jury determines that Monsanto's flagship weed killer, Roundup, contributed to his cancer, and more damningly, that the company failed to warn him of the severe health risks. For Johnson, it is a monumental legal victory. For a 155-year-old German institution 5,000 miles away, it is the beginning of an existential financial collapse. Just 2 months before this verdict, Bayer AG closed a $63 billion all-cash acquisition of Monsanto. It was the largest foreign takeover in German corporate history. Bayer executives celebrated the deal as a masterstroke, a visionary merger of human health and crop science that would feed a growing global population and secure the company's revenue for a century. They believed they were buying the world's most advanced agricultural engine. They did not realize they had just purchased a liability machine. Within hours of the San Francisco verdict, Bayer's stock plummets, wiping out $10 billion in market value in a single trading session. It is the first crack in the foundation. Over the next few years, that single lawsuit will multiply into a staggering avalanche of over 100,000 claims. The legal settlements will drain more than $10 billion from Bayer's cash reserves. But the true destruction happens in the open market. By the time the dust settles, Bayer's total market capitalization will collapse by more than $60 billion. The German titan will find itself worth less than the $63 billion it paid to acquire Monsanto. This is not a story about a failed product. Roundup remains on shelves, generating billions in revenue, backed by environmental regulators worldwide. This is a story about the deadliest blind spot in corporate strategy. It is an investigation into how the brightest executives in Europe priced a chemical company based on scientific data and agricultural yield, but entirely failed to price the American mass tort system. They bought a company, but they inherited a history. To understand how an elite corporate board sanctioned the most value-destructive merger in modern history, we have to examine the claustrophobic pressures facing the pharmaceutical industry in 2016. Bayer is an institution in Germany. Founded in 1863 as a dyestuffs factory, it evolved into a chemical and pharmaceutical titan, inventing aspirin and synthesizing phenobarbital. For generations, the Bayer Cross logo stood as a global symbol of reliable, clinical German engineering. But by the middle of the 2010s, Bayer's executive suites in Leverkusen were gripped by a quiet, looming panic. The pharmaceutical industry operates on a ruthless biological clock known as the patent cliff. When a company develops a blockbuster drug, it enjoys a government-granted monopoly, usually lasting 20 years from the date of filing. During this window, the drug prints cash. But the moment the patent expires, generic competitors flood the market, dropping the drug's price by up to 90% overnight. In 2016, Bayer was looking directly over the edge of a massive cliff.
Two of its most lucrative products, the blood thinner Xarelto and the eye disease drug Eylea, were scheduled to lose their patent protection in the early 2020s. Together, these drugs accounted for a massive share of Bayer's pharmaceutical profits. The pipeline of new experimental drugs was too thin to replace the incoming billions in lost revenue. Bayer needed a hedge, and it needed one fast. The board looked outward, seeking a second pillar to stabilize the company. They turned to agriculture. The logic was mathematically sound. As the global population surged toward 8 billion, arable land was shrinking. The world needed crops that could survive droughts, pests, and extreme weather. If Bayer could not guarantee a steady stream of blockbuster human medicines, it could dominate the science of feeding humanity. But to dominate agriculture, Bayer needed scale. It needed Monsanto. Headquartered in St. Louis, Missouri, Monsanto was an absolute titan of crop science. It pioneered genetically modified seeds, creating crops engineered specifically to withstand its proprietary herbicide, Roundup. Farmers loved the system.
They could spray their fields with Roundup, killing every weed in sight, while the genetically modified corn or soybeans remained completely unharmed. It was an incredibly efficient, highly profitable loop. But outside the farming community, Monsanto was a public relations nightmare. Environmental activists and consumer groups had spent decades vilifying the company, labeling its genetically modified crops Frankenstein food. In Europe, where suspicion of genetic engineering ran deep, the Monsanto brand was toxic. Bayer's executives looked at the controversy and saw only noise. They were scientists and engineers. They analyzed the data. The active ingredient in Roundup, glyphosate, had been reviewed by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the European Food Safety Authority, and dozens of other regulatory bodies. The consensus among these state institutions was clear. Glyphosate, when used as directed, did not pose a carcinogenic risk to humans. To the boardroom in Leverkusen, regulatory approval was the ultimate shield. If the science said the chemical was safe and the regulators agreed, then the public outrage was just a branding problem. A branding problem could be managed.
They believed they could acquire Monsanto, strip away its hated name, integrate its brilliant agricultural technology into the respected Bayer ecosystem, and create an unstoppable global life sciences empire. They treated public perception as a soft metric, a temporary friction that could be smoothed over with German corporate respectability. They fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the threat. They were analyzing the deal through the lens of chemistry, when they should have been analyzing it through the lens of liability. The execution of this vision fell to Werner Baumann. A company lifer, Baumann joined Bayer in 1988 and methodically climbed the ranks of the finance department. In May 2016, he was elevated to chief executive officer. He was sharp, driven, and acutely aware of the ticking clock on Bayer's pharmaceutical patents. Baumann did not waste time. Less than 2 weeks after officially taking the CEO job, he launched a massive, unsolicited $62 billion all-cash bid for Monsanto. It was a staggering move that shocked the financial world and immediately drew fire from Bayer's own shareholders. Institutional investors balked at the price tag. They questioned the strategic fit. They warned about the reputational damage of absorbing a company so widely despised by European consumers. But Baumann was resolute. He saw the acquisition as his legacy, the definitive maneuver that would transform Bayer from a vulnerable drug maker into an invincible life sciences conglomerate. Behind closed doors, the negotiations were grueling. Monsanto CEO Hugh Grant knew he held a unique asset. He rejected Bayer's initial advances, forcing Baumann to repeatedly sweeten the offer. By September 2016, the two sides finally agreed on a purchase price of $63 billion, or $128 per share. It was a massive premium, funded by taking on billions in new corporate debt. The ink dried, but the deal still required approval from antitrust regulators across 30 jurisdictions, a process that would drag on for nearly 2 years. During this agonizing waiting period, the blind spot in Bayer's due diligence began to manifest. In 2015, just months before Baumann launched his bid, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, a specialized branch of the World Health Organization, published a report classifying glyphosate as probably carcinogenic to humans. This classification deeply contradicted the findings of the EPA and other national regulators. The WHO agency did not ban the chemical, nor did it regulate it. It merely assessed hazard based on specific epidemiological studies. Bayer's legal and scientific teams reviewed the WHO classification and dismissed it as an outlier. They leaned on decades of EPA data. But they failed to recognize how the American legal system actually functions. In the United States, scientific consensus does not dictate corporate liability.
Juries do. The WHO classification provided trial lawyers with exactly the wedge they needed to bypass regulators and take Monsanto directly to state and federal courts. Across the United States, plaintiffs' attorneys began signing up thousands of farmers, groundskeepers, and landscapers who had used Roundup and later developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. The lawsuits alleged that Monsanto knew about the cancer risks and actively covered them up. While Bayer was busy negotiating antitrust concessions and preparing to integrate Monsanto's workforce, a quiet storm was gathering in American courtrooms. Discovery motions were filed, subpoenas were issued, millions of pages of internal Monsanto emails and documents were quietly being handed over to plaintiffs' attorneys. Bayer's leadership remained confident. They believed the legal claims were baseless, entirely fabricated by opportunistic lawyers. They assumed that because regulators had cleared glyphosate, any lawsuit would be swiftly dismissed by a judge before it ever reached a jury. They prepared for a scientific debate. They did not prepare for a street fight.
On June 7, 2018, Bayer officially closed the $63 billion acquisition. In a highly publicized move, the company immediately retired the Monsanto name, hoping to erase decades of controversy with a simple rebrand. The executives in Leverkusen took a breath, believing the hardest part of the merger, the grueling antitrust marathon, was finally behind them. They were wrong. The nightmare was just beginning. Within weeks, the first Roundup cancer trial began in California. Dewayne Johnson's lawyers did not just argue the complex chemistry of glyphosate, they brought the internal communications of Monsanto executives into the light. This was the mechanism Bayer had entirely failed to model in its financial spreadsheets, the discovery process. American civil litigation allows plaintiffs to demand a company's internal emails, memos, and text messages. What the lawyers uncovered became known as the Monsanto Papers. The internal documents painted a devastating picture of corporate arrogance. Emails showed Monsanto scientists discussing ghostwriting academic papers to defend glyphosate's safety, planning to pay outside academics to put their names on company-drafted research.
Other messages revealed executives cozying up to EPA officials, attempting to kill unfavorable agency reviews before they could be published. One internal email even bluntly stated that they could not say Roundup is not a carcinogen because they had not done the necessary testing on the formulation to make that statement. To a jury, these documents were explosive. They transformed a dry, impenetrable debate about chemical epidemiology into a visceral story of corporate cover-up. The jury did not need a doctorate in toxicology to read an email where a corporate executive mocked regulatory oversight. When the San Francisco jury handed down the $289 million verdict for Dewayne Johnson in August 2018, it shattered Bayer's defense strategy. The stock market reacted with brutal efficiency, erasing $10 billion of Bayer's value almost instantly. But Werner Baumann and his board remained defiant. They publicly insisted the verdict was an anomaly, a rogue California jury easily swayed by emotion. They promised to appeal. They refused to set aside massive legal reserves, assuring investors that the science was still on their side. Then, the dam broke. In March 2019, a federal jury in San Francisco awarded $80 million to another Roundup user, Edwin Hardeman. The jury explicitly found that Monsanto had acted with malice and oppression. 2 months later, in May 2019, a jury in Oakland delivered an even more staggering blow: a $2 billion verdict to an elderly couple who both developed cancer after decades of spraying Roundup on their properties. 3 trials, 3 catastrophic losses. The legal precedent was set, and the plaintiff's bar smelled blood. Television advertisements blanketed American airwaves, urging anyone who had used Roundup and developed cancer to call a toll-free number. The litigation exploded. In 2018, Bayer faced a few thousand lawsuits. By 2019, the number had swelled to 42,000. By 2020, it would surpass 100,000. Bayer's stock went into freefall. Investors fled, horrified by the open-ended, unquantifiable liability that the company had absorbed. The $63 billion agricultural dream had become a financial black hole. The pressure on Baumann became unbearable. In a historic rebuke at the 2019 annual general meeting, a majority of Bayer's shareholders voted against discharging the management board from their responsibilities, an unprecedented vote of no confidence for a major German corporation. Despite the revolt, Baumann clung to his position, backed by the supervisory board. But the financial bleeding could not be stopped with press releases. In June 2020, Bayer capitulated. The company announced a massive settlement framework, agreeing to pay up to $10.9 billion to resolve roughly 75% of the current Roundup claims, without admitting any liability or wrongdoing. It was one of the largest corporate settlements in legal history.
Yet, even this astronomical sum did not close the door. Tens of thousands of claims remained unsettled. New lawsuits continued to be filed. The legal machinery Bayer had purchased refused to shut off. The market ruthlessly repriced the German titan. At its peak before the merger, Bayer's market capitalization exceeded $100 billion. Following the litigation avalanche, it steadily collapsed, plummeting below $60 billion, then below $50 billion. The math was inescapable.
Bayer had paid $63 billion in cash and debt to acquire Monsanto, and the resulting legal chaos had erased more than that exact amount from Bayer's own total value. They had effectively paid $63 billion to destroy their own company. It was a wealth destruction event of breathtaking scale. The strategic rationale for the deal? The brilliant synergy of seeds and chemicals, the hedge against the pharmaceutical patent cliff, was entirely eclipsed by the weight of the courtroom. The agricultural division did perform. It generated billions in sales. But every dollar earned in the field was overshadowed by the billions bleeding out in the courtroom. The Bayer-Monsanto merger stands as a grim monument in the landscape of modern corporate finance. It redefined the very nature of acquisition risk. For decades, the fundamental calculus of mergers and acquisitions was based on future cash flows, market share, and operational synergies. Due diligence meant auditing the balance sheet, checking the physical assets, and verifying the patent portfolio. Bayer executed this traditional playbook flawlessly. They bought a highly profitable company with a dominant market position. But they failed to understand that in the 21st century, when you acquire a company, you do not just acquire its assets, you acquire its entire history. The mechanism that broke Bayer was not a failure of agricultural science. It was a failure of institutional imagination. The executives in Leverkusen operated under the assumption that regulatory approval was a definitive shield against legal liability. They believed that because the EPA declared glyphosate safe, the American legal system would inevitably align with that finding. They failed to recognize that the courtroom is not a laboratory.
In a mass tort trial, the burden of proof operates on a different axis. A jury does not just evaluate chemical structures, it evaluates corporate behavior. The internal emails, the ghost-written studies, the cozy relationships with regulators. These were the true toxic assets buried inside Monsanto. Bayer paid $63 billion for a company, but it was essentially buying an unexploded bomb of public distrust wired directly to the American civil justice system. The fallout fundamentally altered Bayer's trajectory. Instead of investing billions in research and development to discover the next generation of life-saving medicines, the company was forced to divert massive reserves to pay legal settlements and manage debt. The grand strategy to secure the future of food ended up mortgaging the future of the company. Werner Baumann ultimately stepped down in 2023, leaving behind a fractured, heavily indebted corporation that still faces thousands of pending lawsuits. The pharmaceutical patent cliffs that terrified the board in 2016 arrived exactly on schedule, but the agricultural hedge that was supposed to save them had instead pulled them underwater.
The market capitalization of the 155-year-old institution remains a shadow of its former self, trapped beneath the weight of a single, catastrophic decision. The legacy of this $63 billion deal is a chilling warning to every boardroom in the world. It proves that the true cost of an acquisition is rarely found in the financial statements. It is hidden in the emails, the culture, and the decades of decisions made before the ink ever dries. When science, public perception, and the legal system collide, the resulting explosion can instantly reprice a century of success into an existential threat. If a company's value is ultimately determined not by what it creates, but by what a jury decides it owes, how can any institution accurately measure the ghosts of its own past?